Get your head down.
I'm broadcasting to them.
Check fire! Check fire! They're bracketing the ridge. The radio static hissed, cutting through the thunderous crack of AK-47 rounds impacting the shale rock. Dust and pulverized stone hung in the air like a suffocating gray curtain. "Johansson, get your head down or you're dead weight," Sergeant James screamed, dragging her by the vest behind the crumbling remains of a goat shed. Blood pooled beneath his thigh, dark and slick against the dust. Katy Johansson didn't flinch. Her hands moved with a terrifying surgical precision over the interface of her jamming equipment. The screen flickered red. "Sarge, the lieutenant is gone. We can't break contact," Katy said, her voice eerily flat amidst the chaos. "They aren't trying to kill us. They're hurting us." I said, "Get your head down." James racked the slide of his M4, his face contorted with pain and adrenaline. "We need air support, not your tech toys." "Air is 10 minutes out. We have 2. Katy looked up, her eyes locking onto James's wild, panicked gaze. "I can stop them, but I have to drop the localized jamming to broadcast. If you drop the jammer, they detonate the IEDs on the road. We're boxed in." "I know," Katy whispered, her finger hovering over the execute key. "That's why I'm not broadcasting to base. I'm broadcasting to them." James stared at her, the realization of her suicide play dawning too late. "Katy, don't..." She pressed the key. The interior of the MH-47G Chinook smelled of hydraulic fluid, unwashed bodies, and the metallic tang of anxiety. It was a smell Staff Sergeant Katy Johansson knew well, though she had never been welcomed into its source. She sat near the ramp, her knees pulled tight against her chest to minimize her footprint. To her left and right, the men of Ranger Chalk 2 sat like stone statues, their faces obscured by ballistic helmets in the lowering darkness. They were a single organism, a hive mind of muscle and kinetic violence. She was the foreign object. "1 minute." The crew chief held up a single finger, his voice crackling over the internal comms. Katy checked her rig for the 3rd time. The Wolfhound Tactical Direction Finding System strapped to her pack added 30 pounds to her load, bringing her total gear weight to nearly 80 pounds. She was 5'6". The man next to her, a saw gunner named Corporal Holloway, was 6'2" and looked at her pack with a shake of his head that wasn't hidden by the shadows. "Don't fall, don't lag, don't speak." The mantra played on a loop in her head. The Chinook flared, the nose pitching up aggressively as the pilots fought the downdrafts of the Spingar Mountains. The gravitational force pressed Katy into the nylon webbing of her seat. "LZ is hot! Dust out! Go, go, go!" The ramp dropped, revealing a swirling vortex of brown dust and jagged rocks under the green glow of night vision goggles, NVGs. The Rangers moved with fluid efficiency, unclipping and surging forward. Katy followed, her boots hitting the uneven shale. The drop was higher than expected, a 4-foot plunge into darkness. She landed hard, her knees buckling under the extra weight of the signals gear. She stumbled forward, gloved hands scraping against the sharp granite to catch herself. A hand grabbed her shoulder, not to help, but to shove. "Move it, Johansson! You're choking the ramp!" It was Sergeant First Class Brody. His voice was a growl, low and filled with a weary irritation that cut deeper than a shout. He didn't wait for her to recover. He bypassed her, his weapon already up and scanning the ridgeline. Katy gritted her teeth, swallowing the retort that burned in her throat. She pushed herself up, the heavy straps of the Wolfhound digging into her trapezius muscles, and sprinted into the tree line to join the formation. They formed a security perimeter, a semicircle of silent barrels pointing out into the Afghan night. Katy took her position at the rear, the designated slack, where she could do the least damage. She pulled her headset tight, checking the signal spectrum on the tablet mounted to her chest. "Chalk 2, status," the lieutenant's voice whispered in her earpiece. "Set. Luggage is secure," Brody replied. Luggage. Katy stared at the spectral green waveforms dancing on her screen. The nickname wasn't new, but hearing it broadcast on the command net was a deliberate humiliation. It was a reminder. She wasn't a ranger. She was equipment, a piece of sensitive gear that had to be carried, protected, and eventually returned to the box. The platoon began to move, a silent snake winding up the steep goat trail. The air was thin, the altitude already clawing at her lungs. Katy adjusted her grip on her M4, forcing her breathing into a rhythmic cadence. They expected her to fail. They were waiting for her to ask for a break. She would die before she asked for a halt. As they climbed, Katy watched the spectrum analyzer. The valley was silent, too silent. Usually there was chatter, ICOM radios, cell phones, something. But the electromagnetic spectrum was a flat line. "Sergeant Brody," she whispered into her mic, breaking her self-imposed silence. "I'm getting 0 RF signature. It's a complete blackout." "Keep the channel clear, Johansson," Brody snapped back immediately. "We know it's quiet. That's why we're here." He didn't understand. Silence in this valley wasn't just absence of noise. It was a discipline. It meant someone had ordered the locals to turn off their phones. Katy looked up at the looming peaks surrounding them. The dark shapes of the mountains felt like the jaws of a trap slowly closing. She checked her weapon again, the cold metal biting into her palm. They thought she was the liability, but as they marched blindly into the dark, she feared she was the only one seeing the cliff edge. The mountain did not care about rank, gender, or clearance levels. It only understood gravity and oxygen, and right now, it was denying Katy both. They had been climbing for 2 hours. The incline was a brutal 45 degrees of loose shale and unforgiving scrub brush. At 8,000 feet, the air was thin enough to make every breath taste like copper. Katy's lungs burned with a cold fire, her chest heaving against the restrictive ceramic plates of her body armor. Up ahead, the Ranger Point man, a wiry staff sergeant named James, moved with the effortless grace of a mountain goat. Behind him, SFC Brody set a pace that was borderline sadistic. It wasn't a tactical march, it was a hazing. They were pushing the speed to the red line, waiting for the luggage to crack. Katy kept her eyes glued to the boots of the man in front of her. Step, breathe, step, breathe. The straps of the wolfhound system cut into her shoulders, restricting blood flow to her arms. Her legs felt like lead weights, trembling with the lactic acid buildup, but she refused to stumble. She knew that if she tripped, if she so much as slipped on a patch of scree, Brody would call a halt, not to help her, but to humiliate her. He would verify his bias, that she didn't belong here. They crested a false summit, the wind whipping over the ridge with a biting chill. Brody raised a closed fist. Freeze. The squad dropped to one knee in unison, weapons scanning the dark void. Katy sank down, her vision swimming slightly. She forced herself to take slow, controlled sips from her hydration bladder, knowing that gulping water at this altitude would only lead to cramps. Brody moved down the line, checking his men. He stopped beside Katy. In the monochromatic green of her NVGs, his face was a ghostly mask of hard lines. He didn't speak. He just stared at her heaving chest, then checked his watch. The message was clear. "You're holding us back." He tapped his helmet and signaled forward. "Move out." Katy pushed herself up. Her muscles screamed in protest. As she took her first step, her boot caught on a root system. She looked down to steady herself. That was when she saw it. 3 feet to the right of the trail, a patch of wild sage had been crushed. It wasn't wind damage. The stalks were bent outward, away from the trail, and the leaves were matted into the dirt. Someone had knelt there. Recently. Katy scanned the ground closer. A rock about the size of a fist had been overturned. The underside was darker, moist earth exposed to the dry air. Her heart hammered against her ribs, harder than the exertion warranted. The Rangers, in their aggressive push for speed, had bypassed it. She clicked her radio key twice, a soft, static burst to get attention, and hissed into the boom mic. 01, this is 26, visual on disturbed vegetation, 6 o'clock low. Brody halted. He looked back, irritation radiating from his posture. He didn't come back to inspect. He simply keyed his mic. 26, keep moving. We're burning daylight. Sarge, it's fresh, Katy insisted, her voice tight. Someone was watching the trail. We're 5 clicks from the target village, Johansson. It's a goat path. Goats walk here. Locals walk here. Move. The break angle suggests... I said move, Staff Sergeant. Brody's voice was a steel door slamming shut. Eyes on the objective. Stop looking for ghosts. Katy froze for a second, the overturned rock staring up at her like a bad omen. In the intelligence world, a detail like this was a blinking red light. In the Ranger world, speed was security. They believed they were the hunters moving too fast to be caught. But the crushed sage told a different story. They were being watched. She tightened her grip on her rifle and stepped over the evidence. She had no authority here. Her job was to listen to the radio, not to tell the door kickers how to walk. They pushed on. The terrain grew rockier, the path narrowing as they approached the final ridgeline overlooking the target village. The physical agony of the climb became a dull, background roar, drowned out by the sharpening dread in Katy's gut. 30 minutes later, they reached the OP. The village lay below them, a cluster of mud brick compounds nestled in the valley floor, silent and dark. It looked like a graveyard. Brody signaled for the squad to fan out and set security. Katy dropped her pack behind a low rock wall, her hands shaking as she pulled out the directional antenna. She wasn't shaking from the climb anymore. She was shaking because the valley wasn't just quiet, it was dead. She powered up the Wolfhound. The screen flickered to life. She watched the frequency spectrum, waiting for the jagged peaks of radio chatter. Nothing. Just the flat, hissing line of static. Brody crawled over to her position, his whisper barely audible over the wind. "What have you got, Johansson?" "Nothing," she said, looking up at him. "And that's the problem. Even the cell towers are dormant. Someone pulled the plug." Brody stared at the village, chewing his lip. For the first time, the arrogance in his eyes dimmed slightly, replaced by the calculating look of a predator sensing a shift in the wind. "Maybe they're asleep," he muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. "No," Katy replied, looking back at the dark trail they had just climbed. "They're waiting." The Wolfhound sat on a flat rock, its glowing green display casting a sickly pallor onto Katy's face. She had her headset pressed so tight against her ears that the foam cups were digging into her skin, blocking out the wind that howled through the crags of the Spingar. She was hunting for ghosts. Down in the valley, the target village was a collection of shadows. No lights, no movement, no dogs barking. To the naked eye, it was asleep. To the electronic eye, it was a black hole. 3 minutes to LD, Sergeant Brody's voice cracked over the inter-squad net. "Safety off. Dial it in." Katy ignored the chatter, her fingers flying across the keypad of her receiver. She widened the bandwidth, scanning from low-frequency HF bands up to the UHF ranges used by commercial radios. Nothing. The noise floor was flat. "This isn't right," she whispered to herself. In a valley like this, there was always background radiation, leaking microwaves, old television signals bouncing off the ionosphere, the constant chatter of unencrypted ICOM radios used by farmers and insurgents alike. A total blackout required effort. It required a strict, enforced emission control, MCON plan. Suddenly, a spike. It was there and gone in the blink of an eye. A jagged vertical line on the spectrum analyzer that lasted less than 0.4 of a second. Katy froze. She hit the buffer replay key, isolating the timestamp. She expanded the waveform. It wasn't static. It wasn't a glitch. It was a digital packet, compressed and burst transmitted to minimize detection. She ran a quick decryption algorithm. The Wolfhound couldn't crack the content in real time, but it could identify the modulation type. Frequency hopping spread spectrum. Her blood ran cold. This wasn't the signature of a ragtag militia or a local warlord. This was military-grade tradecraft, the kind used by state actors or highly trained mercenaries. The enemy wasn't just waiting, they were synchronized. Katy ripped the headset off one ear and scrambled sideways, crab walking over the loose shale toward the command cluster. Lieutenant Driscoll was kneeling behind a jagged outcrop, checking his map with a red lens flashlight. Brody was beside him, observing the village through thermal binoculars. "Lieutenant, we need to abort," Katy hissed, breathless not from exertion but from fear. Driscoll looked up, his face painted in camouflage grease, eyes narrowing. "Keep your voice down, Johansson. What is it? I just caught a burst transmission. High band, encrypted, frequency hopping. It originated from the northern ridge directly opposite us. Brody lowered his binoculars and scoffed. A radio burst? That's your reason to scrub the mission? It's not just a radio burst, Sergeant, Katy countered, her voice trembling slightly with the intensity of her certainty. It's a synchronization signal. The entire valley is in MCON. They turned everything off to lure us in, and that burst was the awake command. They know we're here. Driscoll looked at his watch. Intel says the HVT is in that compound tonight. We have a narrow window before he moves. If we wait, we lose him. Sir, the profile doesn't match a financier, Katy pressed, leaning in, desperation clawing at her throat. Financiers use cell phones and sat phones. They don't use complex signal encryption that defeats my scanners. This is a killbox. That signal was a trigger. Or it was a glitch, Brody interjected, turning back to the lieutenant. Sir, we've got thermal on the objective. No sentries. No heat signatures on the roofs. If they were waiting for us, we'd see bodies. That's exactly the point, Katy whispered harshly. You don't see them because they are dug in deep. They are undisciplined insurgents. They wouldn't have this kind of discipline unless someone professional is running them. Driscoll hesitated. For a second, the young officer looked from the dark village to the frantic intelligence specialist. The burden of command weighed heavy in the silence. But then the radio on his chest crackled. Command to Ranger 2-6. Time on target is -2 mics. Green light, execute. The order from higher headquarters severed the debate. Driscoll's face hardened. The decision was no longer his to make. We have the green light, Driscoll said, his voice dropping into the flat, detached tone of an officer committed to action. Johansson, stay here with the support element. Keep monitoring. If you hear anything else, let us know. Sir, please. Pack it up, Johansson, Brody snapped, standing up and adjusting his plate carrier. You're spooked. Let the Rangers do the work. Katy watched them go. The assault element melted into the darkness, moving down the slope like wraiths. She wanted to grab them, to scream, to physically stop them from crossing the line of departure. But she was just an attachment, a linguist with a heavy backpack and a theory no one believed. She crawled back to her position and pulled the headset back on. Below, 20 men were moving silently toward the village perimeter. On her screen, the spectrum remained flat. But Katy knew better now. That flat line wasn't empty space. It was the held breath of a predator before the strike. She zoomed in on the frequency where the burst had appeared, her finger hovering over the record button, waiting for the scream that she knew was coming. God help them, she whispered into the cold wind. The first Ranger breached the outer wall. From her vantage point on the ridge, the war looked like a silent, grainy movie. Katy watched through the monocular of her night vision, the green phosphor display rendering the world in shades of emerald and black. Below, the assault elements stacked up on the heavy wooden door of the main compound. They were professional, efficient, moving with the synchronized fluidity of a machine. She saw the breacher tape the linear charge to the frame, back away, and give the thumbs up. Breach, breach, breach. The transmission in her ear was calm, almost bored. A flash of white light bloomed on the screen, followed seconds later by the dull crump of the detonation rolling up the valley walls. Smoke poured from the doorway, illuminated by the sweep of IR lasers. The Rangers flowed into the breach, weapons up, scanning corners. Katy held her breath. Her eyes flicked to the wolfhound display. The spectrum was still flat. It was wrong. It was all wrong. If this was a raid on a high-level financier, there should be panic. Phones lighting up, distress calls, screaming. Instead, the radio crackled with a confusing report. Dry hole. I repeat, target building is dry. No packs, no intel. It's a ghost town. Brody's voice came next, tight with suspicion. Check the cellar. They have to be here. Negative, Sergeant. Dust is settled. Nobody's been here for days. Katy felt a sick knot tighten in her stomach. The warning she had given about the disturbed vegetation and the burst transmission screamed in her mind. It's not a hideout. It's a stage. 2-6, this is actual. Driscoll's voice cut in. Collapse the perimeter. We're RTB. Something feels off. Copy, moving to extraction. As the Rangers turned to exit the compound, the valley floor disintegrated. It started not with a gunshot, but with the earth itself erupting. A daisy chain of improvised explosive devices, IEDs, buried along the mud walls of the perimeter, detonated simultaneously. The shockwave hit Katy on the ridge a second later, a physical punch of overpressure that rattled her teeth. Below, the courtyard was engulfed in a cloud of debris, fire, and pulverized brick. Contact! Contact front! IEDs! The radio dissolved into chaos. Screams overlapped with the staccato rhythm of automatic gunfire. But this wasn't the sporadic spray and pray of terrified insurgents. This was rhythmic, disciplined, suppressing fire. From her high ground, Katy saw what the men on the ground couldn't. Muzzle flashes sparkled from the tree line on the opposite ridge and from the rooftops of the buildings surrounding the courtyard. It was a classic L-shaped ambush, designed to catch the unit in a crossfire where every inch of cover from one side exposed them to fire from the other. They're bracketing us. We're pinned. Man down! Holloway is down! Katy watched Lieutenant Driscoll. He was in the center of the courtyard trying to rally his men, shouting orders that were being swallowed by the noise. He grabbed the handset of his radio, likely calling for fire support. Then a single distinct crack echoed above the din. Driscoll's head snapped back violently. A mist of heat, visible even on thermal, sprayed into the air behind him. He crumpled to the dusty ground, his body going limp with the terrifying finality of a marionette whose strings had been cut. Lieutenant, the RTO, radio telephone operator, scrambled toward him, but rounds kicked up the dirt inches from his face, forcing him back. Sniper! High ground, north face! Katy saw the shooter, a single heat signature, prone on a rock shelf 500 meters away, separate from the main ambush line. He wasn't shooting rapidly. He was waiting, picking his targets. Brody, the LT is down! The LT is gone! The RTO's voice cracked, bordering on panic. The chain of command had been severed in the first 30 seconds of the engagement. The Rangers, elite shock troops trained to dominate the battle space, were now disorganized, trapped in a kill box that had been prepared for them with mathematical precision. Katy gripped her rifle, her knuckles white. She was safe on the ridge, outside the kill zone. She could stay low, she could survive, but the radio chatter was a chorus of dying men. Smoke! Pop smoke! Brody's voice roared over the net, ragged but alive. Drag him to the shed. Get off the X. The Rangers threw smoke grenades, the thick gray plumes obscuring the courtyard. They dragged Driscoll's body and the wounded Holloway into a small, roofless goat shed on the edge of the compound. It was meager cover, crumbling mud brick that wouldn't stop a heavy caliber round. They were trapped. The enemy had cut off their retreat, killed their officer, and now they were closing in. Katy looked at the wolfhound. The spectrum was no longer silent. It was alive with a single, hopping frequency, a steady, rhythmic pulse. The enemy commander was directing the slaughter, and he was doing it without screaming. She realized with a jolt of horror that she was the only one who could see the entire chessboard, and she was the only one the enemy didn't know about yet. 01, this is 2-6. Anyone copy? She whispered into the mic, hoping the jammer hadn't kicked in yet. Static. The trap had snapped shut. I reckon the sound of a DHK heavy machine gun is not a bang. It is a rhythmic, percussive thumping that resonates in the chest cavity. Thump, thump, thump. From the northern ridge, the Russian-made 12.7mm weapon opened up, firing down into the open roof of the goat shed where the Rangers had dragged Lieutenant Driscoll's body. The rounds didn't just penetrate the mud brick walls, they disintegrated them. Fist-sized chunks of masonry exploded inward, turning the Rangers' only cover into a cloud of choking red dust and shrapnel. On the ridge above, Katy realized her position was compromised. Tracers were beginning to zip past her head, green fireflies searching for flesh. The enemy was flanking, sweeping the high ground to eliminate any overwatch. She had two choices: retreat back down the mountain into the dark and likely survive, or slide down into the cauldron of the village to join the men who had mocked her. She didn't think. She grabbed the straps of her wolfhound and threw herself over the edge of the scree slope. Katy slid 40 feet down the steep embankment, riding a landslide of loose shale. She hit the valley floor with a bone-jarring impact, rolling to absorb the momentum, and scrambled on hands and knees toward the breach in the compound wall. Bullets kicked up geysers of dirt around her boots. She dove through the doorway of the goat shed just as an RPG slammed into the outer wall. The overpressure wave lifted her off the ground and slammed her against a pile of rubble. For a moment, the world was nothing but a high-pitched ringing and the taste of blood. She blinked the dust from her eyes. The scene inside was a tableau of hell. "Suppressing fire! Get that gun up!" SFC Brody was screaming, his face masked in blood from a laceration on his forehead. He was firing his M4 blindly over a crumbling wall, trying to keep the enemy heads down. Next to him, the medic was working frantically on Corporal Holloway, whose legs were a mess of torn fabric and tourniquets. Lieutenant Driscoll lay in the corner, covered by a poncho, his boots still and unnatural. "Johansson!" Brody saw her, his eyes wide with a mix of shock and fury. "What the hell are you doing here? You should have stayed high." "The ridge is hot," Katy yelled back, crawling toward him. "They're sweeping the heights." Thump, thump, thump. The DJHK rounds chewed through the top layer of the wall, sending a shower of brick dust down on them. A scream cut through the noise. Private James clutching his shoulder as a ricochet tore through his deltoid. "We need air!" Brody grabbed the RTO, shaking him. "Get me the J-TAC! Get me a stack!" "I can't!" The RTO was hyperventilating, his hands shaking so violently he couldn't manipulate the dials. "It's all static. I'm getting jammed on every net. I can't reach the bird." Brody grabbed the handset himself, pressing the transmit button. "Any station, this is Ranger 26. We are declaring Broken Arrow. I repeat, Broken Arrow. We are overrun at grid." Another RPG shrieked out of the darkness. It impacted the pillar directly behind Brody. The explosion collapsed a section of the roof. Katy curled into a ball as heavy timber and mud bricks rained down. When the dust settled, the firing momentarily paused, the enemy reloading or maneuvering for the kill. "Sarge!" Katy pushed a heavy beam off her legs and crawled forward. Brody was half buried in debris. He wasn't dead, but he was out. His eyes were glazed, unfocused, his helmet cracked. He tried to speak, but only a wet gurgle came out. Concussed, maybe internal bleeding. Katy looked around. The lieutenant was dead. The platoon sergeant was down. The squad leader, Staff Sergeant James, was pale and shocky from blood loss. The RTO was curled in a fetal position, staring at his useless radio. The firing started again, closer this time. They were closing the noose. Katy looked at the faces of the remaining men. The arrogance was gone. The mockery was gone. In their eyes, she saw the raw, naked terror of men who realized they were going to die in a dirt hole, thousands of miles from home. She felt a strange coldness wash over her. It wasn't courage, it was clarity. The panic that gripped the others didn't touch her. She was an analyst. To her, this wasn't a fight anymore. It was a problem set. Variable 1, we are outgunned. Variable 2, we cannot retreat. Variable 3, we cannot call for help. There was only one variable left to change. She crawled over to the RTO, grabbed him by the vest and pulled him upright. "Give me the handset," she said. Her voice was steady, cutting through his panic like a knife. It doesn't work," he stammered. "They're jamming us." "I know," Katy said, reaching for her own pack, for the wolfhound. "That's why I'm not calling our side." She looked at the unconscious Brody, then at the terrified Rangers. "Check your ammo," she ordered, the command sounding alien coming from her own mouth. "Prepare to move on my signal." "Move!" James looked at her like she was insane. "Move where? We're surrounded." "Not yet," Katy said, her eyes drifting to the enemy repeater tower, visible through a crack in the wall. "But I'm about to buy you a ticket out." The air inside the ruined shed tasted of copper and cordite. It was the taste of defeat. "Check your mags," James shouted, his voice cracking with the strain. He was the acting squad leader now, a 24-year-old kid trying to hold back a tide of veterans. "I've got one full, one partial. Last mag. I'm Winchester on the saw. I'm out." The reports were a death knell. The Rangers had expended their combat load in the initial furious minutes of the ambush. They were kinetic warriors designed to overwhelm with superior firepower, take away their guns, and they were just men in a mud hole. Katy sat in the corner, shielded by the body of a dead donkey and a pile of rubble. She wasn't checking magazines. She was staring at the Wolfhound's display, her eyes burning from the dust. The RTO, Private Silva, was sobbing quietly while still trying to crank the frequency on the massive PRC 117 radio. "It's nothing," he choked out. "Just white noise. They're blasting every channel. SATCOM is dead. VHF is dead." "Stop trying to punch out, Silva," Katy said, her voice eerily calm. "The jammer is too close. The signal-to-noise ratio is a -10. You're shouting into a hurricane." "So what do we do?" James turned to her, wild-eyed. "We die." "Quiet," Katy snapped. She pressed the headset cups deeper into her ears. On the screen, the frequency-hopping signal was still dancing, a jagged, rhythmic red line cutting through the static. The enemy commander. He was broadcasting again. She adjusted the squelch, filtering out the background noise of the DCK hammering the walls. The voice came through. It was distorted, digitized, and rapid, but to Katy's trained ear, it was as distinct as a fingerprint. "Iktisahu al-mintaqa. La tatruku ahadan hayan. Al-an. Sweep the area. Leave no one alive. Now." Katy froze. The breath hitched in her throat. She knew that voice. She didn't just know the language. She knew the cadence, the specific, educated lilt of the vowels, the imperious, terrifyingly calm delivery. She had spent 6 months in a windowless room at Fort Gordon, listening to recordings of this man. Intelligence had nicknamed him the Weaver, al-Haik, because of how he interlaced different insurgent cells into a single, cohesive fabric. He was a ghost, a high-value target that JSOC had been hunting for 3 years. He wasn't supposed to be here. He was supposed to be in Pakistan. "It's him," Katy whispered. "Who?" James crawled over, wincing as a bullet impacted the wall above them. "The commander," Katy said, looking up, her eyes locking onto James's. "It's al-Haik, the Weaver. This isn't a random ambush, James. He's orchestrating it personally. That's why the jamming is so sophisticated. That's why you're pinned." "Does that help us kill him?" James asked, spitting dust. "No, but it helps us lie to him." Katy ripped the connector cable from the Wolfhound and jammed it into her own handheld radio. She began furiously typing on her wrist keypad, accessing a library of pre-recorded audio files she kept for psychological operations, though she was never authorized to use them like this. "What are you doing?" Silva wiped his nose, watching her. "I can't break their encryption to talk to our air support," Katy said, her fingers blurring, "and I can't stop their jammer. But their system relies on a central repeater, a master node." She pointed to the spectrum analyzer. "He's transmitting on a localized loop. If I can match his frequency and his encryption key, which I can, because the Wolfhound just cloned it, I can inject a signal." James shook his head. "Speak English, Johansson." "I can mimic his voice," Katy said, the gravity of her plan settling on the room. "I can give a new order." The firing outside intensified. The enemy was prepping for the final assault. They could hear the shouts now, closer, just beyond the wall. "You want to give orders to the Taliban?" James looked at her like she had lost her mind. "They'll know it's fake. Not if I use his call sign, not if I use his dialect, not if I sound exactly like him," Katy insisted. "I've studied him for months. I know his syntax. I know how he clears his throat." "And what are you going to tell them?" "To stop," Katy said. "To fall back." "That's suicide," James said. "If you broadcast on their net, their direction-finding equipment will light us up. They'll drop a mortar right on this shed. They're already going to kill us, James." Katy's voice rose, cracking with the first sign of emotion. "We are dead in 5 minutes when they breach that wall. This is the only play." A heavy explosion shook the ground, a grenade thrown over the wall. Shrapnel pinged off the debris. James looked at the wounded men. He looked at the dead lieutenant. He looked at his empty magazine. He turned back to Katy. The mockery was gone. In its place was the desperate hope of a drowning man reaching for a lifeline. "Do it," James whispered. Katy nodded. She keyed the microphone, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She wasn't a ranger. She wasn't a shooter, but right now she was the only weapon they had left. She took a deep breath, closing her eyes, summoning the ghost of the Weaver into her mind. She prepared to speak. "Do it," James had said. The command hung in the dust-choked air, a desperate permission slip for the impossible. Katy nodded, her fingers trembling as she adjusted the frequency dial on the Wolfhound. But as she watched the signal strength indicator on her display, the green bar hovered stubbornly at the bottom of the scale. "Damn it," she hissed, tapping the screen. "What?" James was beside her instantly, his eyes darting to the breach in the wall where the enemy fire was chipping away the bricks. "What's wrong? Send the signal." "I can't," Katy said, her voice tight. "We're in a depression. The mud walls contain iron oxide. They're acting like a Faraday cage. My signal is bouncing back at us. If I transmit from here, the enemy repeater won't even hear a whisper. So boost the power. I am at max power, but their jammer is pumping out 50 watts from that ridge. Physics is physics, James. To override them, I need the capture effect." James stared at her blankly. A grenade detonated somewhere outside, shaking dust from the ceiling. "English, Johansson. FM radio is winner take all," Katy shouted over the ringing in her ears. "If two signals hit a receiver on the same frequency, the stronger one suppresses the weaker one. To hijack their network, my signal has to be physically louder than their commanders." She looked up at the jagged hole in the roof, where the night sky was lit by the streaking arcs of tracer fire. "I need line of sight," she said, the realization settling in her stomach like a stone. "I have to get to the roof. I need to point the directional antenna straight at their repeater tower." James grabbed her vest, yanking her down as a burst of machine gun fire stitched a line across the wall behind her head. "No," he barked. "Absolutely not. The roof is the kill zone. That déchiquet is chewing up anything above 4 feet. You go up there, you're pink mist in 3 seconds. If I don't go up there, we're all dead in 2 minutes." Katy shoved his hand away. It was the first time she had ever physically challenged a ranger. The adrenaline spike was dizzying. "They are flanking us, James. Once they get an angle on this shed, it's over. You know that. I'm not sending a support attachment to die while I sit in a hole." James's face was contorted with a mix of toxic masculinity and genuine protective instinct. "That's not how this works. You stay down. We hold the door." "You can't hold the door with empty guns," Katy screamed back. She grabbed the Wolfhound unit, unhooking the heavy battery pack to lighten the load, keeping only the internal power source. It gave her 5 minutes of juice. Enough. "This isn't your call anymore, Sergeant," she said, her voice dropping to a steely calm. "This is a SIGINT warfare environment. I am the subject matter expert. You are the security element. Your job is to keep them off me while I work." James looked at her. He looked at the blood on his uniform, at the terrified eyes of Private Silva, at the body of his lieutenant. He realized she was right. The kinetic fight was lost. The only weapon left was the radio. He let out a ragged breath, the fight draining out of him. "If you go up there, I can't cover you. The DHHK has the angle." "I know," Katy said. She checked her helmet strap, wiping sweat from her eyes. "Just make sure they don't come through the door until I'm done." "Johansson," James said, gripping her shoulder one last time. His grip was hard, desperate. "Make it count. I'm just luggage, remember?" She offered a grim, humorless smile. "Luggage doesn't bleed." She didn't wait for a response. She turned and scrambled up the pile of rubble that led to the exposed second-story ledge. The air grew colder as she climbed. The noise grew louder. She was ascending out of the grave and into the fire. Katy crested the lip of the mud brick wall, and the world exploded into noise. Down in the shed, the war had been a muffled, terrifying, chaotic din. Up here, on the exposed flat roof, it was a physical assault. The air was alive with the supersonic snap hiss of rounds passing inches from her face. To her left, the DHK on the ridge hammered away, its rhythmic thumping vibrating through the soles of her boots. She didn't run. Running would trigger the predator instinct of the gunners. Instead, she moved with a low, deliberate crawl, dragging the Wolfhound system through the debris of a shattered chimney. "Don't look at the tracers. Look at the tower." She spotted it, a thin metal spire silhouetted against the moonlight on the northern slope. About 2 clicks out, the repeater node, the nerve center of the ambush. Katy pushed herself up into a kneeling position behind the chimney stump. It offered meager cover, barely covering her torso. Her head was exposed. The night vision goggles weighed down the front of her helmet, pulling her neck forward. She ripped them off. She needed to see the display on her chest without the green washout. She raised the directional antenna, aiming it like a rifle at the distant tower. "Come on," she whispered, her thumb hovering over the transmit key. "Lock on." The Wolfhound's signal strength bar flickered. Yellow, orange, then a solid burning red. Signal capture achieved. She was now electronically louder than the enemy commander. For the next few seconds, whatever she said would override his voice on every radio in the valley. Katy closed her eyes for a heartbeat. She wasn't Katy Johansson, the luggage, the support attachment who slowed the squad down. She had to become Al-Haik, the Weaver. She had to channel the arrogance, the weariness, and the absolute authority of a man who had sent hundreds to their deaths. She pressed the key. "Isma'u!" "Listen." Her voice boomed over the encrypted frequency, distorted by the digital mask she had applied to match the Weaver's vocal print. The firing below didn't stop immediately. Inertia carried the battle forward. Katy took a breath, the dust coating her throat, and spoke again. This time she used the specific, localized Pashto dialect of the Peck Valley. The dialect the Weaver used when he was angry. "Nakab Isur, Nakab Isur," red veil, red veil. It was a code phrase she had heard in a decrypted file 3 months ago. It meant ambush, compromised, trap reversed. "The Americans have air on the ridge. You are walking into a hammer. Break contact. Break contact immediately." She infused the words with panic. Not the panic of a victim, but the furious panic of a commander realizing he has been outsmarted. "Pull back to the line of gold. Do not engage. They want you to add Johansson. Pull back." She released the key. For 3 seconds, the DSHK continued to pound the wall below her. It didn't work, she thought, her heart sinking. They know. Then silence. It happened so fast it was physically disorienting. The heavy machine gun stopped mid-belt. The small arms fire from the eastern flank sputtered and died. The RPGs that had been raining down on the compound ceased. The sudden quiet was louder than the gunfire had been. It rang in her ears, a high-pitched, tinnitus whine. Katy stayed frozen behind the chimney, her chest heaving. Had they bought it, or were they just reloading? From the radio on her chest, a confused voice crackled back, a sub-commander sounding hesitant. "Say again, Weaver? We have them pinned. The kill is ready." Katy keyed the mic instantly, cutting him off. She didn't let him think. She barked the response, channeling pure, unadulterated rage. "Do you question me, Habib? Look at the sky. The drones are already overhead. If you fire another shot, you mark your own grave. Withdraw." It was a gamble. She had no idea if there were drones, but fear was a powerful multiplier. She waited. 1 minute passed, then 2. The shadows in the tree line began to move, not toward her, but away. The heat signatures on the ridge stood up and began to retrograde, fading back into the darkness of the mountains. They were leaving. The ambush was breaking. Katy slumped against the cold mud brick, the adrenaline crash hitting her like a physical blow. She let out a breath she felt she had been holding since the helicopter ride. 2-6 actual, she whispered into the squad net, her voice trembling now that the performance was over. "Condition set. The board is clear." "Johansson?" James's voice came back, filled with disbelief. "What the hell did you say to them?" "I told them," Katy said, looking at the retreating shadows, "that they were the ones in the trap." She lowered the antenna. She had done it. She had saved them. But as she moved to crawl back down, a single beam of light cut through the darkness. It wasn't a flashlight. It was an IR laser. It originated from the high rocky outcrop where the sniper had been hiding, the one who had killed the lieutenant. He hadn't retreated. He wasn't on the radio network. He was a freelancer. Or perhaps he was just disciplined enough to know that the Weaver never panicked. The laser dot danced across the roof and settled directly on Katy's chest. She froze. The deception had worked on the army, but it hadn't worked on the hunter. The green laser on her chest was steady, unblinking. It was a silent accusation. He knows. The sniper on the ridge hadn't been fooled by the voice of the Weaver. He was watching the roof. He had seen the silhouette of the woman with the antenna. Katy threw herself flat just as the air split with a deafening crack. The bullet impacted the mud brick inches from her left shoulder, showering her face with razor-sharp fragments of baked clay. The thump of the rifle report followed a split second later. A heavy caliber, likely a Dragunov or a PSL. "Johansson, get down here! We're moving!" James's voice screamed in her earpiece. "I'm pinned!" Katy yelled back, pressing her face into the gravel of the roof. "Sniper! North Ridge! He has the angle!" Down in the courtyard, the Rangers were dragging the litter with Holloway and carrying the lieutenant's body. They were exposed. They had 50 meters of open ground to cover before they reached the defilade of the dry creek bed. Katy peeked over the crumbling rim of the wall. The laser danced away from her position. It swept down into the courtyard. It found James's back. The sniper wasn't interested in her anymore. He had suppressed the radio threat. Now he was going for the easy kills. Katy felt a cold resolve settle in her gut. It was heavier than the armor, heavier than the wolfhound. If she stayed down, she survived. If she stayed down, James died. The squad died, and her promise to save the team became a lie. She looked at the wolfhound. The battery was dead. The deception was over. "No," she whispered. She grabbed her M4 carbine. She didn't have the marksmanship training of a ranger. She couldn't hit a prone target at 500 meters in the dark, but she didn't need to hit him. She just needed to make him look at her. She needed to be the noise. "James, go! Go now!" she screamed into the mic. "Johansson, don't!" Katy scrambled up to a kneeling position. She didn't seek cover. She exposed her silhouette against the moonlight, a black shape rising from the ruins. She shouldered her rifle, aimed high at the northern ridge, and squeezed the trigger. Pop, 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 pop. The muzzle flashes were blindingly bright in the darkness, a beacon screaming, "I am here!" The laser on James's back vanished instantly. It snapped back up to the roof, locking onto the flash of her rifle. "That's it," she gritted out, firing until the bolt locked back on an empty chamber. "Look at me! Look at me!" The sniper fired. The round took her in the shoulder plate. It felt like being hit by a sledgehammer. The impact spun her around, knocking the wind out of her lungs and throwing her onto her back. The pain was immediate and white-hot, radiating down her arm. She gasped, staring up at the stars. "Get up!" She rolled over, using her good arm to push herself up. She grabbed a smoke grenade from her vest, pulled the pin, and threw it, not for cover, but to draw the eye. The hiss of the red smoke billowing out was a final challenge. From the ridge, the sniper made a call. Not a shot, but a call. A moment later, a whoosh sound tore through the valley. An RPG. Down in the creek bed, James turned back. He saw the roof of the goat shed. He saw the red smoke swirling around the small, defiant figure of the support girl who had refused to be luggage. "Katy!" The RPG warhead struck the base of the chimney. The explosion was absolute. The entire roof disintegrated in a flash of orange fire and black smoke. Masonry, timber, and the shattered remains of the wolfhound system were lofted into the air before crashing down into the courtyard below. The radio channel went dead, just static. "Move!" James screamed, the tears carving tracks through the dust on his face. "Move! Don't let it be for nothing!" The Rangers surged forward, disappearing into the shadows of the wadi, carrying their dead and wounded away from the kill zone. Behind them, the dust settled over the ruin. The sniper scanned the debris for a moment, waiting for movement. There was none. The valley returned to silence. The cavalry arrived 20 minutes too late for the mission, but just in time for the retribution. Two AH-64 Apache gunships swept over the ridgeline, their 30mm chain guns unleashing a torrent of high-explosive rounds onto the northern slopes. The DHK position that had pinned 2nd Platoon was vaporized in a series of dull, rhythmic thuds. Following them, the heavy whump-whump-whump of CH-47 Chinooks filled the valley, blowing away the lingering smoke of the battle. The Quick Reaction Force, QRF, hit the ground like a sledgehammer. Rangers from 1st Platoon swarmed the village, clearing compounds with ruthless efficiency. Staff Sergeant James sat on the ramp of the extraction bird, his face a mask of grime and dried blood. The medic was working on his shoulder. Lieutenant Driscoll's body was already loaded in a body bag near the cockpit. "We're lifting in 2 mics," the crew chief shouted. James shoved the medic away. "No, we're not leaving." "James, sit down. The bird is spooled up." "We are missing one." James stood up, swaying slightly. "Johansson, we left her at the shed." "The support girl?" The QRF platoon sergeant looked at the smoking ruin of the goat shed 300 meters away. "James, that building took a direct RPG hit. There's nothing left." "I said we are not leaving." James didn't shout. He growled, a sound that came from the bottom of a shattered chest. He grabbed his rifle, though he had no ammo left. "She drew the fire. She's the only reason you aren't loading me into a bag right now." He stepped off the ramp. One by one, the surviving members of his squad, Silva, the wounded Holloway leaning on a teammate, and the others, stood up and followed him. They didn't speak. They just formed a wedge and walked back into the dust. They reached the pile of rubble that had been the shed. It was a tomb of jagged brick and smoldering timber. The heat was still radiating from the stones. "Dig," James ordered. They threw aside their weapons and began tearing at the debris with their bare hands. They lifted heavy beams, ignoring the splinters and the burns. They worked with a frantic, silent desperation, listening for a sound, a breath, anything. "Here!" Silva yelled, his voice cracking. "I see Kevlar!" They converged on the spot. James heaved a slab of mud wall aside, revealing a pocket of space created by the fallen chimney. Katy was there. She was curled in a fetal position, half buried in dust. Her helmet was cracked, the night vision mount sheared off. The wolfhound system was gone, obliterated. Her face was caked in gray powder, blood trailing from her nose and ears from the overpressure. She looked small, smaller than she had ever looked standing in formation. "Medic!" James roared. The QRF medic slid down the scree slope, bag open. He placed 2 fingers on her carotid artery. The Rangers held their breath, the seconds stretching into hours. "I've got a pulse," the medic said. "It's thready, but it's there." A collective exhale went through the squad. It sounded like a prayer. "Let's get her on the litter. Watch her neck. Easy, easy." They lifted her with a tenderness that seemed alien to men built for violence. They strapped her down, securing the IV lines. James took the corner of the stretcher, refusing to let anyone else carry the weight. They carried her back to the waiting Chinook. This time, no one complained about the pace. No one checked their watch. No one called her luggage. As they loaded her onto the bird, the ramp hissed up, sealing them in the red-lit belly of the beast. The helicopter lifted, banking hard to escape the valley. James sat next to the stretcher, watching the rise and fall of her chest. Her uniform was shredded. The patch on her shoulder, the intelligence insignia, was stained dark with blood. Katy's eyes fluttered open. She blinked, the red light confusing her. She tried to move, but the pain was a heavy blanket pinning her down. Her eyes found James's. She tried to speak. Her lips moved, forming a silent question. "Did we make it?" James leaned in close. He took her hand. A breach of protocol, a breach of rank, a breach of everything except humanity. He squeezed it, his dirty, calloused fingers wrapping around her small, bruised ones. "We're clear, Johansson," he whispered, his voice thick. "We're all clear. You stopped them." She let out a breath, her eyes closing again as the morphine took hold. A single tear cut a track through the dust on her cheek. The Rangers sat in the semi-darkness, the roar of the rotors vibrating through their bones. They looked at the woman who had climbed the roof when they had stayed on the floor. They looked at the Pog who had spoken with the voice of a warlord to save their lives. There were no speeches, no slow claps, just the heavy, reverent silence of men who knew exactly what the cost of their survival had been. Katy Johansson went back to sleep, the rhythm of the flight rocking her gently. She hadn't done it for their thanks. She hadn't done it to be one of them. She had done it because she was a soldier, and the silence in the valley was finally, blessed, real.